Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we start out to the west of Avdiivka, where the Russians have managed to make a small advance in the direction of Karelivka. In this they have managed to cross over this crossing between the eastern outskirts to the eastern parts of Karelivka towards the central parts of it in the southern area. There's the southern area and the northern area. And with this, we see that the Russians are restarting offensive operations after it stopped on the 19th of June. So after a 10-day break, the Russians are now advancing again in the Karelivka direction, following the assaults towards Nevelsky and the general operations towards Yasnogrodivka to the north, and the capture of the eastern outskirts of Karelivka and a foothold in the northern parts. So we're seeing the situation continues to develop in this section, although it is very slow. Further north, we see here the direction of Sokal. The Russians captured the final parts of the village and are now moving into Avdiivka. They have managed to gain a foothold within that village. They've also managed to advance towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians north of Avdiivka and have managed to capture one of the ones here by the railways and have managed to capture the southern defensive fortifications of Novoalexandrivka behind the Ukrainian lines. So with this, we see the Russians are advancing across the western parts of Ocheretine, both in the direction of Vovchansk, Lusovatsk, and a foothold in Avdiivka as Russians continue to advance along the railways. So with this, we see that the Russians continue their offensive operations here in the west of Avdiivka, which has not stopped since the Russian capture of the city. The Russian objective here is 3 points: the city of Pokrovsk to the west, the crossing between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka with the highway going in between them. There is this area between Vovchansk and upwards in the northern direction where there is this chokehold here between the highway from the west to the east and Konstantinivka itself in the north. In that regards, the Russian offensive operations continue in the direction of Toretsk, where we have several pieces of footage that we have to cover. The first one is this bombing of the New York town here south of Toretsk. We see these two pieces of footage of FAB 3000 being used in the city of New York in Ukraine, where we see massive explosions taking place as a result of these explosives. So with this, we see that the Russians are heavily bombarding with FAB 3000s, not just in Kharkiv in the north, but also in the Toretsk direction here in the east. And this is ahead of further offensive operations by the Russians, where we have this news report here by the Russian Ministry of Defense, surprisingly, coming out first with this information. It is reported that the unit of, quote, Veterans Air Brigade took a large command post in the Toretsk direction using a dug underground tunnel. This happened for the second time, where the first time was in the city of Avdiivka, here to the northwest of Donetsk, where the Russians advanced from the fortified areas here to the southeast of Avdiivka and to this Zarka, or the restaurant area, which was a fortified outpost of the Ukrainians. The Russians passed through it, entered the residential area from an underground tunnel, and managed to cut off the Ukrainian positions in that fortified position. According to the report here in the direction of Toretsk, there was a 3-kilometer advance from the canal, which points towards somewhere right here in the center of Pivnishne, which indicates that the fortified outpost that the Russians took control of, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense report, is likely either this hill here, which is a fortified position of the Ukrainians, or the surrounding areas by the railway station. So with this, we see that the Russians have likely, according to this report, if the report is true, it is likely true based on a Ministry of Defense report, but it is not confirmed until we either get footage of the operation or footage of the Russian presence there, or independent sources corroborating this report. Until then, we will remain it as it hasn't happened, but I'm telling you about this because it is a very significant development if it is true, and it is likely to be true. So with this, we see that the Russians would have taken advantage of a new tunnel here in the Toretsk direction, which could have led to a significant breakthrough. I previously mentioned how the Ukrainians have multiple lines of defense in the Toretsk direction. They have the first line of defense, which goes from the canal area through Pivnishne, and then down here by Shumi and towards Pivdene, and further south here all the way through New York. Then there's the second line of defense within Pivnishne and the hills here to the east of Toretsk. If the Russians have managed to break through both defensive lines and capture this strong point here in the second line of defense, they would have broken through the second line of defense, and the Russians would have a clear road from their positions in Avdiivka and directed towards the heart and center of Toretsk, which is a very significant development if true. This could rapidly change the situation in Toretsk, similar to how the breakthrough happened in Avdiivka, and significantly change the situation there. And that is why I decided to talk about it, because it is such a significant development if it is true and would completely change the front line. In the direction of New York, we also have this footage here, which shows Russian armored vehicles, likely Russian armored vehicles or Ukrainians, there's no confirmation about it, destroyed in the road. But then it zooms into this motor vehicle driving through the roads towards New York, and it is a motorbike which has Russian soldiers driving on them, and this is one of the new Russian strategies. They've also been using it in Staromayorsk, both e-scooters and motorbikes, sending troops to the front line, highly mobile, highly maneuverable vehicles, which allows these soldiers to drive through. We see despite the artillery shell hitting their positions, they managed to avoid the impact and survive this strike. He then is seen to pick up the motor vehicle again. It is disabled, so they decide to pick up their equipment and take up positions nearby. These Russian soldiers completely switched the strategy and maneuverability and the ability to reach frontline positions through the use of these motor vehicles. Although they are much more vulnerable in these open positions, it doesn't matter if the tank is going to be destroyed anyways, the infantry fighting vehicle is going to be destroyed anyways by the artillery, drones and mines, then might as well be more maneuverable and speedy, which allows for further progress and a better possibility for taking up positions within the town or city, which then allows for better cover than armored vehicles can ever provide. In the end, orthodox methods are what is used on a broad scale, but when something works, then you have to take advantage of that until a countermeasure is being built. As long as the Ukrainians do not have frontline soldiers shooting down these motor vehicle drivers, then they are going to continue doing this for as long as it succeeds. Further north in the direction of Jesev Yar, we see this counterattack by the Ukrainians with an infantry fighting vehicle flanking the Russian positions from the north. However, it was destroyed by Russian FAB drones. We see that the Russians continue to advance here in the Donetsk section of the front line. We see positional fighting in the Jesev Yar direction, with the general advantage being on the Russian side. In the Kreminna section, there's a bit more back and forth. In Vovchansk, it was largely the Ukrainians counterattacking and recapturing positions, but now we're seeing a Russian counterattack here in the Vovchansk direction. They stormed the first apartment buildings here in the central parts, where the Ukrainians have their biggest concentration of troops in the northern parts of Vovchansk. This operation, as is seen in part with this footage here, shows how the Russians are storming these apartment complex buildings from infantry moving from building to building, and there is heavy fire taking place both on the Russians hitting the Ukrainian positions and the Ukrainians hitting the Russian positions. Artillery strikes, FPV drones, airstrikes, everything is happening constantly in Vovchansk, with 24/7 around-the-clock explosives and firefights taking place. We constantly hear gunfire and explosives in the background of this video. We see flashes everywhere, and the Russian troops just storm through from building to building after they have this cover from the massive artillery strike, suppressing the Ukrainian soldiers within the city, preventing them from hitting these Russian soldiers and detecting them. So the Russians move through the ruins of some of these apartment complex buildings, climbs on top of them, enters the building and fights through it, try to clear it, and then move on to the next one. And this is the start of a massive battle over the apartment complex area. We're likely going to see a lot of fighting in this direction over the next days and probably more than a week of heavy fighting. The Ukrainians are trying to cut off the Russians in the aggregate plant. The Russians are storming the apartment complex area head on. If the Russians manage to capture the apartment complex area, or even support it by pushing through in the aggregate plant, they will be able to significantly weaken the Ukrainian positions in the northern parts of the Vovchansk river line. Although the Ukrainians will still have very strong positions in the north, it would completely switch the situation around. If the Russians introduce new units to the front, they'll be able to push the Ukrainians away from the northern parts of the Vovchansk river line. So this shows that despite all of this happening, the Russians are still able to organize their positions in the north, conduct counterattacks, and regain the initiative despite the heavy fighting and the numerous Ukrainian soldiers fighting in Vovchansk. And with that, it just confirms how dynamic warfare is. We can never predict what happens or how the situation develops. There's going to be a lot more back and forth in Vovchansk before the battle is determined, before the battle ends. And this is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.